Thieves, fraudsters, poachers, and forgers. Malefactors such as these have haunted societies across millennia, their methods evolving while their motivations remain eerily consistent. Renaissance Florence, despite its artistic splendor and intellectual achievements, grappled with the same criminal enterprises that plague our modern streets today. While artists crafted masterpieces and architects raised magnificent domes toward heaven, Florence's magistrates and lawmakers were quietly revolutionizing how society dealt with wrongdoers. The city that gave birth to perspective painting also pioneered a new perspective on crime and punishment, one whose shadows still stretch across our modern judicial systems. The prison of Stinche stood as Florence's monument to this transformation, a stone testament to changing attitudes about justice, redemption, and the social fabric that bound citizens together. Far from the romanticized version of Renaissance life found in textbooks, these walls contain stories of innovation amid brutality, mercy alongside retribution. As we journey through Florence's narrow streets and imposing judicial chambers, we'll discover how a city renowned for beauty and intellectual advancement also wrestled with humanity's darkest impulses and established frameworks for addressing them that would echo through centuries. Let's travel back in time and explore the fascinating world of Renaissance justice in the cradle of modernity. Welcome to Folks of Yore. Let's set the stage for our criminal justice adventure by understanding Florence itself. Our story covers roughly the period from 1293, when the famous Ordinances of Justice were enacted, to 1530, when the Florentine Republic fell. This was Florence's golden age, when the city shone as the brightest star in the Renaissance constellation. What made Florence so special? In a word, money. While the rest of Europe was largely operating under feudal structures, where land equaled power, Florence had undergone a dramatic transformation. As the historian Alfred von Martin put it, Florence presented the complete rhythmic progression of the type of cultural epoch dominated by the bourgeoisie. Fancy academic talk for saying, the merchants took over and everything changed. Think about it. Medieval society had been built around who owned the soil. Your typical power player was some guy with a title living in a drafty castle collecting dues from peasants working his land. But in Florence, power had shifted to the popolo grosso, literally meaning the fat people, merchants, bankers, and manufacturers who controlled the flow of capital. This shift created an aristocracy of commerce, where your bank account mattered more than your bloodline. And believe me, these new elites had very healthy bank accounts. The Florentine florin became the dollar of medieval Europe, the gold standard that everyone trusted. Beginning in 1434, Cosimo de' Medici of the ultra-wealthy Medici family established the family's subtle but powerful rule that would last over a century, during which you'd often hear "Vivano le palle," long live the balls, referencing the Medici family symbol of 5 red balls and 1 blue one on a shield. Yes, you heard that right. Long live the balls was a legitimate political slogan. But what does all this cultural and economic transformation have to do with criminals and prisons? Absolutely everything, as we're about to discover when we knock on the imposing doors of Stinche. At the heart of Florence's criminal justice system stood an institution that would influence the future of punishment throughout the Western world. Stinche Prison, which operated from 1301 until 1835. Now, Stinche is an unusual name with a fascinating etymology. The prison got its name because the first prisoners thrown into this newly constructed communal jail were political captives taken from a Ghibelline stronghold called Castello delle Stinche, a castle perched on a hilltop belonging to the Cavalcanti family. And no, despite what you might be thinking, there's apparently no etymological connection between Stinche and the English word stench, though as we'll soon discover, the place definitely lived up to that association too. Over the centuries, Le Stinche hosted some remarkable guests. Francesco Berni, a satirical poet, found himself locked up for debt in the 15th century. Being a poet, he naturally wrote about his experience in a work called In Praise of Debt. Talk about making the best of a bad situation. Giovanni Villani, one of Florence's most famous chroniclers, also spent time behind its walls. So did Benvenuto Cellini, the celebrated goldsmith who was convicted of SA in 1556 and sentenced to 4 years in Le Stinche. Perhaps most notably, none other than Niccolò Machiavelli was temporarily incarcerated there in 1513 while being questioned about a conspiracy. After enduring 6 turns on the rack, medieval torture didn't spare the intellectuals. He wrote poems describing his surroundings that paint a vivid, if nauseating, picture of prison conditions. According to Machiavelli, the place reeked, and the walls were crawling with vermin. He described one prisoner being chained, another loosened, and a third crying out as ropes hoisted him too far from the ground during torture. Not exactly a 5-star accommodation. The word Stinche eventually became so associated with miserable conditions that it entered Florentine vocabulary as a metaphor for any terrible situation. Over time, Stinche even became a generic term for prisons throughout Italy, but the principal reference remained the Florence facility. What's remarkable is that despite these unpleasant conditions, Le Stinche represented something revolutionary in the history of punishment, a completely new approach that would eventually transform how the entire Western world dealt with criminals. Here's where things truly get fascinating. Before Florence pioneered a new approach, imprisonment throughout Europe wasn't generally used as punishment itself. I know that sounds strange to our modern ears, but stick with me here. The Justinian Digest, which formed the basis of much medieval law, stated, "Prisons exist only in order to keep men, not to punish them." In other words, you weren't thrown in prison as your punishment, you were thrown in prison until your punishment, which usually meant execution, mutilation, or some form of public humiliation. Prisons were essentially human storage facilities where you awaited trial or execution. They weren't intended as places to serve a sentence. But Florence changed this fundamental concept. In the Archivio delle Stinche, the prison's remarkable administrative records that survive the centuries, we find commitments of people convicted of theft, homicide, gambling, robbery, and other crimes sentenced to specific periods of time in prison. The Florentines had invented something we now take for granted, the prison sentence. This might not sound revolutionary to us, but in the context of medieval justice, it was mind-blowing. Instead of cutting off a thief's hand or executing a debtor, Florence began using time itself as a punishment. You stole something, you'll spend 6 months in Le Stinche. This was a seismic shift in how society conceived of justice. Le Stinche also introduced other innovative practices that were centuries ahead of their time. The prison separated different populations, men from women, children from adults, and the sane from the insane. This basic principle of prison management, which we take granted for today, was established in Le Stinche in the early 1300s according to the prison's founding documents. Prisoners were housed in separate cells, with serious offenders segregated from minor ones, and heretics kept apart from common law violators, another practice that wouldn't become standard elsewhere for centuries. Perhaps most remarkably, Florence began using imprisonment as an alternative to corporal punishment for debtors and bankrupts. Instead of putting debtors in stocks or subjecting them to public humiliation, they were sent to the Stinche for a calculated period. Unlike elsewhere in Europe, where pre-trial detention could last years, Florence limited it to 30 days by statute. The prison also established formal release procedures, allowed furloughs and conditional releases, and practiced commutation of death sentences to prison terms of 5 to 10 years. Children, by demand of their parents, could be imprisoned for amendment or correction, suggesting that even in the 14th century, Florentines recognized that imprisonment could serve rehabilitative purposes, not just punitive ones. For perspective, most of these practices wouldn't become standard in other European countries until the prison reform movements of the 18th and 19th centuries, a full 400 years later. In many ways, when John Howard, the famous English prison reformer, visited prisons in the 1700s and advocated for changes, he was unwittingly arguing for principles that Florence had already implemented in the 1300s. So why did Florence lead this revolution in criminal justice? The answer lies in the unique cultural and economic transformations happening in Renaissance Florence. In medieval society, where life moved at an agricultural pace and power was tied to land, time wasn't particularly valuable. Seasons came and went, generations passed, and cathedrals took centuries to build. But in Florence's mercantile society, everything accelerated. Time became precious. After the 14th century, clocks in Tuscan cities began striking all 24 hours of the day, a reflection of this new awareness that time was measurable, limited, and valuable. Antonius of Florence recognized time as a thing most precious and irrecoverable. Florentine merchants developed a new relationship with time. As one wealthy Florentine, Leon Battista Alberti, noted, those who knew how to exploit time and money could fully make themselves masters of all things. When your wealth depends on commerce rather than land, every day represents potential profit or loss. In this context, the equation time equals money became literal truth. And here's where the connection to punishment gets interesting. If time has value, then taking away someone's time becomes a meaningful punishment. Think about the difference between traditional medieval punishments and imprisonment. When a medieval judge ordered a thief's hand cut off, the punishment was static, permanent, and symbolic. The hand that stole is removed. But when Florence sentenced someone to a year in the Stinche, the punishment was dynamic. It took away the precious resource of time. In the prison records, we find fascinating examples of this time-money equivalence. The prison regulations repeatedly mention that a certain number of days equals a certain portion of money. If you couldn't pay your debt, you paid with your time instead. The councils and courts of Florence made careful calculations converting financial obligations into temporal ones, a practice that appears to be among the first of its kind in Europe. This approach reflected the broader Florentine mindset, which was increasingly mathematical and precise. There's another fascinating aspect to this shift in the concept of punishment. The concept of liberty itself was evolving. The Renaissance celebrated individualism and personal freedom in ways the medieval mind hadn't conceived. When freedom of movement and personal autonomy became more valued, restricting that liberty through imprisonment naturally emerged as an appropriate punishment. Under these new social conditions, imprisonment offered other advantages too. Unlike permanent mutilation, imprisonment allowed for potential rehabilitation and reintegration. After serving time, an individual could theoretically return to productive society without the permanent stigma of physical punishment. In a mobile, commercial society, this made practical sense. Despite its revolutionary concepts, Life inside Le Stinche was far from pleasant. The prison occupied a large, quadrilateral area isolated from the rest of Florence by streets on all sides, creating a self-contained world of misery within the bustling city. As we've already heard from Machiavelli's first-hand account, conditions were grim. Overcrowding was common, sanitation was minimal, and vermin were abundant. Disease spread easily, and violence among prisoners was frequent. Yet compared to other medieval prisons, Le Stinche was relatively orderly. The prison was administered by officials known as the Soprastante a Le Stinche, who maintained detailed records of commitments, releases, and daily operations. These remarkably preserved records, some 500 volumes housed in Florence's state archives, provide a window into the prison's functioning that historians have only recently begun to explore in depth. The prison population was diverse, reflecting Florence's social stratification. While the wealthy and politically connected might receive preferential treatment, everyone from common thieves to distinguished intellectuals could find themselves behind its walls. For debtors, who made up a significant portion of the prison population, Le Stinche operated somewhat like a debtor's workshop. They could continue working inside, applying their earnings toward their debts. Friends and family could visit to provide food, clothing, and other necessities, as the prison itself provided only minimal sustenance. For more serious offenders, conditions were harsher. Those convicted of violent crimes might be kept in chains or subjected to additional restrictions. The worst cells were reportedly in the lower levels, where dampness, darkness, and poor ventilation made life especially miserable. Still, even for these prisoners, the Florentine approach was distinct. Rather than being forgotten until execution, they served defined sentences with clear terms for release. The prison maintained specific schedules for religious services, meals, and even occasional diversions for the inmates. Though I doubt anyone was leaving a 5-star review of their stay at Hotel Stinche on Medieval TripAdvisor. Le Stinche stood for over 5 centuries before it was finally demolished in 1835, after being sold under the approval of Leopold II. The Accademia Filarmonica and later the Teatro Verdi were built on its site, a cultural center replacing what had been a center of punishment. Though the building disappeared, its memory persisted in Florence's urban landscape. Via del Mercantino was renamed Via dell'Isola delle Stinche as a reminder of the former prison's location. But Le Stinche's true legacy extends far beyond Florence's street names. The Florentine innovation of imprisonment as punishment eventually spread throughout Europe and then the world. When the Amsterdam Houses of Correction opened in 1596, followed by similar institutions elsewhere, they were building upon concepts that Florence had pioneered centuries earlier, making Florence the true birthplace of modern concepts of imprisonment. What makes this history particularly fascinating is how clearly it demonstrates that our approaches to crime and punishment aren't universal or inevitable. They're products of specific cultural, economic, and social conditions. The Florentine shift toward imprisonment reflected their unique cultural values, their emerging capitalism, their mathematical precision, their changing concept of time, and their new emphasis on individual liberty. In essence, they punished criminals in ways that made sense within their cultural framework, just as they revolutionized art with perspective, banking with advanced financial instruments, and politics with new forms of republican governance. The Florentines also transformed how society deals with those who break its rules. Thanks again for joining us on Folks of Yore, looking at history from the human side of things. As always, I'm fascinated to hear your thoughts on this topic. Do you think you'd be able to survive a sentence in Le Stinche? And let me know what other hidden corners of history you'd like us to explore in future episodes. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell to make sure you don't miss a future video. And remember, in the immortal words of the Florentines, long live the balls. Until next time.